Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be here in São Paulo at the invitation of CIBRI. I apologize for not being able to speak Portuguese, so I will speak English instead. Even though this is my first trip to Brazil, Brazil by no means is unfamiliar to me, because for your information, when Brazil did not make the champion at the World Cup in South Africa, it probably broke more hearts in China than it did in Brazil, because Brazil has so many fans in China, and football, samba, and carnival, etc., are so famous. They are household names. Therefore, I think relations between China and Brazil come along very naturally. For your information, if you need being reminded, the last colony that Portugal withdrew from was not in Africa. It was not in Latin America. It was in Macau, China. And it took place as recently as in 1999, only 11 years ago. Therefore, yesterday when I was driving around in São Paulo, many street scenes seemed eerily familiar to me because I've been to Macau many times. Therefore, I think we again have many ways of cooperation. I will talk about China and Africa, then I will talk about China-Brazil, even though I have zero knowledge about Brazil. But then I will talk about China-Brazil in Africa. You know, as a habit and a tradition in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, every year the Chinese Foreign Minister will make his first overseas trip to where? Not to Washington, not to Moscow, not to EU, but to Africa. And this tradition has been going on for about 15 years. So every year the first overseas trip by the Chinese Foreign Minister is always going to Africa. And while President Obama of the United States made the first presidential trip of the United States to a country in sub-Saharan Africa, to Ghana last year, the Chinese president, the Chinese prime minister, the Chinese chairman of the National People's Congress, etc., every year they go to Africa. They not only go to oil-producing or mineral resource-rich countries in Africa, they also visit the least developed countries in Africa. To China, Africa is the continent with the largest number of member states in the United Nations. Some panelists already mentioned that in 2006, 48 countries were invited and attended China-Africa Summit in Beijing. We know there are 53 countries in Africa, so who were the 5 countries which were left? They were the 5 countries which did not recognize China as the sole legitimate representative of China. They still keep diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Therefore, these countries are not even invited. Therefore, you can see that China's relations with Africa is not just economical, it is very much political. And I would say China is one of the very few countries in the world which truly feels gratitude towards Africa for many African political support to China on international occasions. Therefore, I think if you purely look at China-Africa relations in economic terms, you may miss a big point. It's always combined, political plus economic. And I think for the first several decades, ever since 1956, when China established diplomatic relations with Egypt, the first African country, it was always political rather than economic. It is only in the last decade or so that the relations are now becoming more and more economically driven, but still very much based on very solid economic considerations. Now, talking about China's economic relations with Africa, I would say very different from the United States or European model, which actually separates the official development aid to African countries from their corporate participation in Africa, if there is any. China has a total solution for different situations in Africa. Why? Because it involves a 2-tiered structure. It's always the government in China taking the initiative. They talk to different African countries, they come up with a total solution, which always includes infrastructure projects, power stations, building of a railway or highway, airport, schools, or hospitals, or gymnasium, or building for the parliament, for example. But then, increasingly so, over the past 10 years or so, China is no longer purely giving free financial assistance to African countries. It's kind of a commercially driven, but initiated by the government, very much involving the corporate participation. Therefore, in addition to the first tier, which is very much driven by the government, or the second tier, you have the Chinese companies following along. Now, for the Chinese companies, I would divide them into two categories, but involving three different types of Chinese companies. One category is the state-owned enterprises. They are divided into two different kinds. One is what we call central government-controlled state-owned enterprises. These are the big guys. Companies like CNOOC, where I used to work as the general counsel until very recently. Companies like Sinopec, like CMPC, like Sinotrain, etc. These are highly sophisticated and conglomerates. They have deep pockets, they have very good financing capabilities, and they actually operate very much under the directives of the central government. Now, the second kind, also in the first category of the state-owned enterprises, are companies which are still state-owned, but they are not controlled by the central government. Many of them are at the provincial level, etc. The second category, or the third kind of Chinese companies, are privately owned companies. They tend to be smaller, they do not listen to the Chinese government that much, and they operate, with a lot of flexibility. Sometimes they do not care that much about corporate governance, about standards, etc. So these companies are very much active in Africa, and I would say China has a unique model for cooperating with African countries because of its total solution, total package, because what China can bring onto the table is not only government aid, but also manufacturing capabilities, but also the ability to take up major infrastructure projects, which most companies in Europe or in America would not even bother to take because it's highly time-consuming, it may not be profitable, etc. But furthermore, more importantly, I would say, China will provide the major market which can absorb many of the commodities, raw materials, and energies that African countries can provide. Therefore, I think China is not purely an investor, even though Chinese investment into Africa is on the increase, even though between 2000 and 2010, China-African trade has increased amazingly from $10 billion to above $100 billion. So it's a tenfold increase within a short period of only 10 years old. Therefore, I think if you compare the Chinese way of engaging Africa on economic and commercial terms with Japanese way of doing things, European or the American ways of doing things, China has a very unique way. Further, I think it's very important to emphasize, 30 years ago, China was as poor as many African countries. China did not have a lot of funds, China did not have a lot of highways or railways, but within a matter of 3 decades, China seems to have very successfully transformed itself. Therefore, in a sense, when we look at Africa, we know for sure that if there is wisdom, if there is good leadership and governance, if there is a very good way of focusing on economic development, many African countries actually can completely transform themselves, because you are talking about a continent of 30 million square kilometers, very large, as one of the panelists mentioned, with only less than 1 billion people. So many African countries has the natural resources and has the capabilities too, if they have the political will, if they have a helping hand, not kind of a one-side, one-way traffic into Africa, but a good way and constructive way of engaging in Africa.